Hi everyone, my name is Leanna Newman, and today we're going to be just talking about this class that I made called Playing with Perception. So we're going to be going over these um, different kinds of illusions and then talking about what they teach us about the brain, and I'm also going to be telling you about the different sensory systems in the brain, just in general, so we can have a little framework with which to work. I'm really sorry that, we couldn't have had this class in person. This coronavirus stuff is kind of crazy. But, I'm going to do my best to make it as interesting and, hopefully interactive as possible. At the end, I have my email, so you can feel free to email me there. Also, I understand there might be this slight buzzing in the background, but I'm just going to do my best to talk as clearly as possible so you can hear me. There must be something up with my computer's microphone, but we're just going to try and work through it as best as we can. Alright, so this is my little About Me slide, just so you have a little bit of an idea about who I am and what I'm interested in and what I'm doing. So I just graduated from Northeastern in December. I was a behavioral neuroscience major and I had a minor in French. And I am going to grad school for a neuroscience PhD in the fall. So I'm actually going to Harvard University. I just committed the other day, which has been super exciting, super fun. So yeah, if anyone has any questions about like applying for PhDs or interested in PhDs in the future, I would totally love to talk about that. I also was pre-med for a little bit, so I'd love to, talk about that as well. I ended up taking the MCAT, so if anyone has any questions about that, feel free to shoot me an email, even if it's not necessarily about this class. But yeah, my favorite part of the brain is the cerebellum. Thought it would be a fun fact. So it's this area that I've worked a lot on that actually there's all of these motor functions that are typically ascribed to it. So usually it's seen as this area for like motor fine tuning. But more recently there have been all these kind of more cognitive roles that are attributed to it. So it's kind of this area of new and exciting work that's being done, and also work that I did mostly in my lab in undergrad. So yeah, it's actually this really cool place in the brain that we won't actually really get to talk about much because it doesn't have a lot to do with perception. But yeah, it's definitely my favorite area of the brain. Alright, so now I just have the overall class outline so you can have an idea of what we're going to be talking about here. So in the beginning, I'm going to talk a little bit about vision. So we're going to have the visual system and then visual illusions. I know that's typically what you think about when you think of, different illusions. So that's, the first one that we're going to do. And then the next section we're going to do is audition, which is hearing. So we're going to talk a little bit about the auditory system in general and then look at some auditory illusions. And then we're going to do some other kinds of illusions that are not as common. They're typically seen in lab settings. So for this one, I really focus on a particular type of tactile illusion and what that means about the brain. Okay, so just to start, something that I always think is really interesting is just to think about the fact that all of our processing goes through our brain. So you can see on the right-hand side, this is a complete nervous system that is, it has been dissected from a human specimen. So from this, you can see all of the matter that helps you perceive the world. Which I think is really interesting to think about and also kind of a bit scary, because through each of these cells and each of these tissues is the only way that we get to experience the world around us. And everything that we perceive is kind of a product of the properties of these cells and of these tissues. So it's something that really sparked my interest in neuroscience. I really wanted to know how it was possible that these tissues could help us experience the world. And that's something that I hope you guys can, get a little bit more of an appreciation for throughout this class. And the fact that there are such things as different illusions really helps us highlight the fact that all we are and all we perceive about the external world is filtered through our brains and through our nervous systems. Okay, so just to get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about neurons, just so we all have a little bit of a basic understanding of the nervous system in general. So down here is just a little diagram of a neuron with all the key parts that are labeled on this diagram. So we have the cell body, which is towards the left, that contains the nucleus. And then on the cell body are these things called dendrites. So the dendrites are kind of the input layer for the neuron. There, where these things called synapses, where cells communicate with each other, are located for the most part. So the dendrites receive all the information and bring it through the cell body into the axon, which is the output section of the neuron. So the axon propagates these electrical impulses that are called action potentials. So action potentials are the way that neurons propagate this signal and then end up releasing neurotransmitters at the axon terminals. So you can also see on this diagram there are these things called myelin that line the end of the axon. So myelin allows the action potentials to propagate more quickly down the axon just through these electrical properties that we don't really need to get into right now. But there are these areas in between the myelin, which in this case in the central nervous system are Schwann cells. And the areas in between are called the nodes of Ranvier. So in these nodes, the action potential is propagated again and is allowed to travel down the axon more quickly. And then, as I said, at the axon terminal, that's where the true output of the cell is. So the axon terminal releases the neurotransmitter. There are a crap ton of different kinds of neurotransmitters in the nervous system, but each different kind can have a bunch of different receptors and affect the brain in a bunch of different ways, and that's how neurons communicate with each other. So in short, they're able to process this electrical signal and then transform it into a chemical signal, and that is how each of the cells end up communicating with each other in the end. So now we're actually going to get into the meat of the presentation now that we know a little bit about neurons. We're going to talk a little bit about the visual system itself. So there's a diagram on the right of the key components of the visual system. So there's the eye, obviously, where light is focused onto the retina. So the retina itself is actually part of the nervous system, the central nervous system that includes like the brain, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So the retina has this central area that's called the fovea. So the fovea itself is where we see things the most clearly, and that's usually in the center of our eye. And then as we get to the periphery, things get a little blurrier. Inside the eye itself, there are two different kinds of photoreceptors. There are rods and cones. So rods are best in dim light, and they don't really have any color perception. Something that's actually really interesting to try is to hold an object that you are not sure of the color of in your periphery and try to guess the color. If you haven't already seen it with your fovea, then you won't be able to tell the color of it in your periphery. And that's because in the periphery, they have the highest concentrations of rods. And in your fovea, we have the highest concentration of cones. So cones themselves are best in bright light, and they're mostly responsible for color perception. So there are three different kinds of cones. There are short, medium, and long wavelength cones. So that just corresponds to the wavelength of light which excites them. So they're usually thought of as blue, green, and red cones. And through there we can see basically all the different colors that we get to see, like in a rainbow. Um, so there's also a blind spot where the optic nerve leaves the eye, so where it leaves the retina. And that's something that we're going to talk about right in the next slide a little bit. And then the optic nerve goes to the lateral geniculate nucleus in the brain, which is part of the thalamus. So the thalamus is basically this big relay center in the brain where almost all of your sensory input goes. So something that's interesting and also like this really common pattern within the brain is that information from your right visual field goes to the left side of your brain, and information from the left visual field goes to the right side of your brain. So that's something that's called contralateral processing. So it's something that's really common. It's common for your motor control, it's common for your somatosensation, which means like the sensing of like your skin. But yeah, so from the lateral geniculate nucleus, after we have our contralateral processing, then it goes to the visual cortex. And at the visual cortex is where we actually see like putting together of our visual information. Okay, so this is just a cute little GIF about how to find the blind spot, which, as we talked about, is the area that the optic nerve leaves the retina and goes to the brain. So you can't always see your blind spot because your brain actually fills it in with different visual information, but it is easy to see if you do this one simple little trick. So there are these other ways you can find it online. You can definitely look them up and try it on your computer if this trick doesn't necessarily work for you. But it ended up working for me, so I figured I would do it just because this class, it was initially supposed to be in a bigger room with the projector and everything, so I wasn't sure about how like the distances would work out. But what you end up doing is you hold your two hands out in front of you, as it shows in the GIF, in kind of like a, paper football goalpost kind of formation. And then you close your left eye and you look at your left hand. And what you do is you move your right hand, like your right finger, back and forth as it shows in the GIF, a little bit until the tip of your right finger disappears. And that's exactly where your blind spot is. So for me, it's always pretty striking because you never realize how much your brain actually is processing the visual information that you're getting, and how much work is going into, making you see a complete picture when there are really areas that you have no photoreceptors at all. Okay, now getting into actual illusions now. So this is something that you all might be really familiar with. It's kind of the most popular visual illusion. So this is something that's called illusory motion. So if you look at the image on the right, and you stare at like the center of the wheel and you look around the image a little bit, you should be able to see that the different wheels start spinning a little bit. Even though we know this is a static image, there's nothing that's actually moving on here, we still perceive different motion. And that in itself is a visual illusion, and it's actually something that's really cool and currently being studied in the neuroscience field today. Okay, and then here's another example of illusory motion. So these little snake things are perhaps one of the most popular and, famous sets of illusory motion that's out there. So if you look at any of the circles and you like scan your eyes across, you'll be able to see some of the circles. They appear like they're moving, but in actuality they're not. And in the next slide, we're just going to talk really quickly about, what we know about illusory motion, because it's honestly, we don't know a whole lot, but there are all these theories that are out there that are really cool and tell us a little bit about how the brain works. Yeah, so why is this happening in general? The short answer is we really don't know for sure. As you can see on the right here, I have our third example of illusory motion. So it almost looks like the ball and the little column there are moving in opposite directions to each other. So it looks like the ball is traveling along the column, but in fact nothing's really happening. So there are some different theories about why this happens. One of them is that your eyes, they make saccades, which are these small movements when you look at a still object. So this is true, no matter what, but it may or may not be the reason that this illusory motion occurs. Whenever you're looking at something, your eyes are making these tiny movements, no matter whether or not you're actually perceiving it, because if you look at something really still for too long, your photoreceptors will, as they say, bleach, which means everything will turn gray, and you want to be able to actually, see what you're staring at for a long time. So they think that due to these small movements of your eye, with these kind of high contrast images, it could be what is creating this kind of illusory motion. Another theory is that it just has something to do with the bright colors next to each other. So as I was talking about the photoreceptors bleaching, your cones, which as we talked about are the color perceiving cells in your eye, they adapt to different color wavelengths at different rates. So they think that if there are these bright colors that are next to each other, your cones will adapt to it at a different rate, and then they'll bleach out at different rates. And because of this different rate of bleaching, there will be some kind of motion perceived as like one of the colors fades to gray a little bit faster than the other, so it almost seems like it's moving. But overall, we don't really know why this is happening, but it's something that teaches us a lot about the properties of our visual perception and how we perceive, light and motion in general. And it's still something that's actually very widely studied in the field today. Okay, so this is probably my favorite example of a visual illusion. It's probably one that you all know. This is actually what got me interested in perception in general and the visual system, and it's, the dress. So I have a picture of it on the right. I know maybe triggering for some of you. It was such a heated debate whether or not you see blue and black or white and gold. I personally, just to interject my own opinion in here, see white and gold, even though I know it's supposed to be blue and black. I've never really been able to see that. But, there's a pretty good reason behind why different people see different colors, and it tells us a little bit about our brain's processing and how we perceive light. And that's something that I'm going to talk about a little bit on the next slide. Okay, so the answer to the dress is what color you perceive the background to be. In actuality, as I mentioned, it was black and blue, but as you can see from the GIF that I have on the screen right now, it really depends whether you perceive the background to be a yellow color or to be a blue color. So what they did was in this, they're cutting out a little bit of the black and blue in the yellow filter and moving it over to the yellow and gold in the blue filter. As you can see, it's the same exact colors, but we perceive it differently based on what we assume to be the color background. Now, this is a really interesting illusion because it's very rare that you would see, an object without seeing the entire background. So in nature, it's not really something that you would find. So in actuality, you'd be able to tell what color the light is that's in the room. But because this is a still image, it's just, cut out, it's only of the dress, our brain kind of fills in the background and informs us about what colors we're seeing. So this is something that, is really interesting. It's a really interesting property of the brain itself. The fact that we can understand that colors themselves, they change the way they look, and their activation of our cones, our color perceiving cells, changes depending on the lighting and yet we still perceive them as the same colors. So for example, when we look at this GIF on the left sides of the color blocks, we know that the dress is, for example, white and gold or it's black and blue. But they're the exact same colors within the color blocks of the blue and the yellow. But we perceive them as the same colors as what the left sides of the dresses are. And it's something that I think is really cool. It's a really interesting property of the brain itself. And it's something that's interesting to think about. There are people who study like color theory and look at the different ways that colors change under different filters of light. And it's just something that's really cool to think about more often. Okay, so now we're going to move on from the visual system, which I think is probably my favorite system for talking about illusions, and we're going to move to the auditory system. So audition, how we hear, is actually, it's pretty simple, but it's pretty interesting. So sound itself is filtered through the pinna, which is our outer ear. It's what you kind of think of as your ear, into the inner ear, and then eventually to this organ that is called the cochlea. So this organ has hair cells, which are these mechanically activated cells. So they're activated by the different, like the pressure of the sound waves in the air. And then it transmits auditory information to the auditory nerve, which then goes to your brain. And the hair cells in your cochlea have both a rate code and a place code. So this is something that's seen quite often in nervous system in general. So with this, it's talking about the rate of the sound wave and the place on the cochlea. So for sounds that are sufficiently low, which means they have a lower frequency, the neurons themselves can fire at the exact frequency of the sound wave, and that's how we perceive this low sound. However, if the frequency gets to be too high, then we have what's called a place code. So the cochlea itself is variably flexible. So it's most stiff towards the end of the cochlea. So the inside of the cochlea actually is what's transmitting these really high frequency sounds. So not only is the brain processing the rate of the firing of the auditory nerve, but it's also processing from where in the cochlea these sounds came. This is the only sense, it's actually pretty interesting, that combines in the brainstem and not in the brain itself. And then it travels to the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, which, as you remember, visual information went to the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then it goes to the auditory cortex for processing. So sound itself is actually really interesting. Since we have two ears, in itself we have this kind of spatial information that's also encoded within the brain. So a lot of it is either due to the timing, like whether it reaches your right ear or left ear first, you can actually tell the direction from which a sound is coming, or it's due to the intensity of the sound. So if a sound is coming from your right side, then it's going to be really loud in your right ear and a little softer in your left ear. And that's just another way that we can tell the direction from which a sound is coming. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about these illusions. I'm going to be presenting them mostly in YouTube videos that kind of exploit these properties of the auditory system. Okay, so the first one of these illusions is something that's called the McGurk effect. So this is actually my favorite illusion with audition. It is this effect by which, I mean, you can click on the YouTube video on the slide and watch it there. It's actually I mean, I don't really want to spoil it before you guys watch it, so if you haven't looked at it yet, please go click on that now, just so when I talk about it and explain what it is, it's not spoiled for you because it's not as fun, but it still works if you do know what it is, so it's not like a big deal. So in this illusion, you see this man saying a single syllable, so it's usually like ba or va or fa or da, either of these. And that same sound is repeated, but the visual information is changed. So the visual information is changed to a man that's saying fa, ba, da, like, but not one that matches with the audition. But your perception of what the sound is changes to whatever it looks like the man is saying. And that's something that I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So yeah, why is this happening? It's something that's really cool. Audition and vision are not really as distinct as you might think. The two are often integrated, and especially with speech, because it's very rare, or you almost never, no, you can never see it in nature, that the sound is distinct from what you're seeing someone say. So you hear the sounds that match with the visual stimulus presented in the McGurk effect. So audio-visual integration is something that's really key to helping us hear things better and helping us understand speech. It's not something that we think about a lot. It's why looking at people's mouths in a noisy room helps you hear them better. So you can just try that next time you're in like a crowded area and you're trying to listen to your friend. If you just look at their mouth, you'll realize that you can hear them a lot better. And it's kind of crazy, but just to think that we're processing audio-visual information way more than we think, and we usually think of it as just this audio information, but it's really this integration of the both of them. Alright, so here's another really interesting auditory illusion. This was popular 2 years ago, I believe. And it's this sound, you can listen to it here, and it's, the main question is, do you hear it saying Yanny or Laurel? And you know, these two sounds don't really sound like each other when I say it like that, but if you listen to it, I can actually hear both of them if I try and listen to it. So if you could just click on the link and give it a quick listen and let me know what you hear, if you can hear both of them, if you can only hear one of them. It's a pretty interesting illusion. So there's like a story behind this that actually, this was the dictionary.com recording of the word laurel, but someone else heard Yanny in it. So yeah, it's actually like a really interesting story, and it tells us a little bit about how our audition works. Yeah, so what is this telling us about the auditory system? Just like the McGurk effect, it's telling us that what we hear is subject to our own interpretation. So it's not infallible. You know, we can hear things that aren't really there, and we can perceive things that aren't necessarily true to reality. So an interesting thing about this is that in the higher frequencies, people hear Yanny, and in the lower frequencies, people hear Laurel. Age could be a factor because higher frequency hearing declines as people get older. So younger people are more likely to hear Yanny, and older people are more likely to hear Laurel. As we talked about before, I'm able to like switch between the two. Maybe it's just because I know that both of them are possible. And as we talked about, hearing is subject to our own interpretation. So if I expect to hear Yanny, I can hear Yanny. If I expect to hear Laurel, I can hear Laurel. You can also look up online if you can't hear both of them. There are people who took out the lower and higher frequencies so that you can hear Yanny or Laurel, and then listening to it again, you'll probably be able to separate them out. Alright, so now we're going to talk about our final system, which is the somatosensory system. So this one is responsible for our sense of touch, which is also called tactile information. So it starts with these sensory neuron dendrites, which, as we talked about, the dendrites are the input section of the neuron. In the skin, the muscle, or the organ, or whatever you're receiving this sensory information from. And then it goes through this dorsal root ganglion in the spinal cord, and then it goes through the dorsal column of the spinal cord, and then into the medulla oblongata, which is in your brainstem. And there it crosses over, which, as we talked about, has this contralateral processing in the brain that's really popular. And then it goes to the primary somatosensory cortex within the brain. There's also a different system for motor control, which is the primary motor cortex. And it's basically like an opposite pathway. So it goes from the primary motor cortex down through the brainstem and then into the spinal cord. But there it's through the ventral pathway. But yeah, it's not something that we're really going to be discussing now, but I just thought it would be an interesting fact to know, just a little bit more about the brain there. So the somatosensory system is also really interesting because it combines the two big sections of the nervous system. So we have the brain and the spinal cord, which compose the central nervous system. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and the peripheral nerves. So the spinal and peripheral nerves are mostly what we're going to be talking about for the somatosensory system. So as it talks about, it contains sensory and motor neurons. So the sensory ones are the ones that are receiving your sense of touch and bringing it to the brain, and then the motor neurons are the ones that are coming back from the brain and then down into your skin to help move everything, essentially. So yeah, it's just something to think about a little bit. If you ever go into any neuroscience course, this is definitely something that you're going to hear about, the central and the peripheral nervous system, and what they entail. So most people, they really think about the central nervous system as being the one that's in charge, but the peripheral is just as important because it brings in all this information about the body, and it helps us understand more about where our limbs are and what is happening to the world around us. It really serves an important function. All right, and now I'm going to be talking about tactile illusions, so any illusion that has to do with the somatosensory system. I just picked one that I thought was really interesting, and it had a paper associated with it. There are actually a lot of papers associated with it because this process is actually very popular, but I just picked one and I referenced it here in case you guys wanted to actually see it later. This is called the rubber hand illusion. And the next slide, I actually have a picture of this setup in case this doesn't make a lot of sense to you guys right now. So it's done in a laboratory setting. The right hand is placed in a box, and a rubber hand is shown. So you can't see your right hand, but you can see the rubber hand, and the rubber hand is placed in an area that's almost like it's possible that the rubber hand could be attached to your body. Both hands are stroked usually in like the middle or the index finger at the exact same time. So eventually the participant will feel that the rubber hand is their own and that their own hand has disappeared. This is accompanied by a decrease in motor cortex activity, which is from the paper that I quoted a little bit earlier on this slide. So what this means is that the brain itself has decreased activity in the area of the motor cortex that's responsible for the hand that they perceive as being lost. So it's not just something that, is like made up by these higher order areas of the brain. It's actually shown in one of the most basic sensory processing areas, which is the motor cortex. And this illusion has actually been very helpful for people who have like phantom pain after amputation, because a lot of times the areas of the brain are still there, so they can feel like itching or pain in these limbs that they actually don't have anymore. And by doing this rubber hand procedure, they actually are able to feel relief, because it allows their brain to calm down a little bit and perceive this new limb as their own, and it allows them to relax the cramped up limb that they can feel. So here's just a picture of the rubber hand setup. As you can see, this one, instead of the right hand, is just using the left hand, but they are unable to see their real hand, and then they can just see the rubber hand. And eventually, as shown on the right hand panel, they perceive the rubber hand to be their own. And something that's really interesting is, like, for example, there have been some studies that they'll actually like strike the rubber hand with the hammer and the person really flinches as if they like, you know, are afraid of their own hand getting hit. And it's something that I think is really cool. It's a really interesting illusion. Uh, it just really goes to show that the brain is not infallible. The brain is able to be tricked. And, you know, the way that we're perceiving the world may not always be perfect. All right, everyone, so that's all I've really got for you today. If you have any questions about any of the content in this class or anything to do with PhDs or pre-med or college in general, I'm really happy to answer any of your questions. I have my name and my email that's right down there. But yeah, if you guys, you know, had a good time learning about the brain, I highly recommend studying it further. It's a really cool organ. There's really a lot of interesting information that, you know, is still coming out, and a lot of really smart people are still needed to uncover all these really cool questions within neuroscience. So yeah, my email is just leannanewman@gmail.com. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to talk to you guys. Again, I'm really sorry that this couldn't be in person, but I'm really glad that at least we will have the opportunity to, you know, have these slides and go through them a little bit, and maybe, I mean, at least I hope that you guys could learn something interesting and think about the world in a little bit of a different way. All right, thanks so much.